What I want to do in this very short lecture is talk about Greek democracy or the development of democracy. Then I want to skip some history, at least in this video, and I want you to read about the Persian Wars, the Peloponnesian War, and then the rest of the video I want to talk about Alexander the Great. And after the time of Pisistratus, Hippias, and Hipparchus, you've got a period where democracy starts to be developed, and this is mainly led by a man named Cleisthenes. And he did a number of different things to promote democracy. So one of the things he did is he organized people into 10 demes, or 10 tribes. And this is where we get the word democracy from. After he breaks up the 10 demes, or the 10 tribes, what he starts to do is give people power. And, sorry to the women listening, but he was giving power to the men. So he organized these 10 tribes, and then what he did was he created legislative bodies, which are much like what we have in modern cities today. So I live in Redwood City. You've got a library board, an architecture board, and so on. So Cleisthenes developed these legislative bodies, and then what would happen is that the tribes, the 10 tribes, would have to pick a certain number of people from their tribe, and these people would be elected, and then they would run the legislative bodies. He also organized a jury system, and this jury system, as you can see from the scene, is organized in terms of elected men. So before, your jury would be mostly the rich people, and now you've got juries that are being elected, and they could be anybody within your community. Now there's always a danger, so remember the whole point of this is to give people the power, which is what democracy is. There's always the problem that someone might come along and want to take power again, like a tyrant. So Cleisthenes developed this idea of ostracism, which means you would be kicked out of your group, and you've heard of being ostracized before. This is where we get the word. So the Athenian men would get together and they would vote on who was the largest threat to democracy. And then they were exiled for a certain period of time. Sometimes it's 10 years. If it's very serious, it can be up to a lifetime ostracism. Cleisthenes also did a few more things. So giving the power back to the people also meant making sure that they could be in charge of religious functions. So you find that priests and priestesses were elected from their own communities. You also get, after a certain time period, and here I give you the date on this particular scene, that judges were then elected, much like what we do today with picking our judges. You also have the idea that in a democracy, wealthy people should pay something. So you've got the idea that the rich were told to pay for these massive parades, massive festivals that were put on almost every single year. And you might think that this was a hardship for the wealthy people, and it actually wasn't. And in some cases, they didn't even mind, because it was an honor to be paying for, say, a festival of Athena, because you get a plaque, and then, of course, your name gets remembered forever. At least that's As I mentioned in the beginning, I am skipping some history. I'm skipping the Persian Wars, and I'm skipping the Peloponnesian Wars, and I'm skipping a bit of Greece in the early 300s, so I want you to read about those in your textbook. Now, jumping ahead to the middle of the 300s, you've got the rise of Philip II and of his son Alexander, who of course is Alexander the Great. And these people are not Greeks, they are Macedonians. Macedonia is a country that is north of Greece. So Philip takes power, and what he ultimately does is he eventually gets invited into Greece to take care of some political problems. And after his invitation ran out, he decided to stay. So he ended up taking over Greece. And the reason this happened so easily is because you've got the Greeks or you've got the Athenians and the Spartans fighting in the Peloponnesian War, which the Athenians ultimately lose, and it leaves them weak. Now, of course, this led to Alexander. So after his father died, Alexander takes over. And Alexander remembered what had happened during the Persian War with the Persians going onto Macedonian soil. So he decided to go to war. So he ends up invading Persia, goes into Egypt, goes into Central Asia, and makes it as far as India. And in the next scene, I will I'll talk a little bit about him growing up and the influence that his mother had, and then I will show you a map of his journeys. Alexander's mother was named Olympia, and she had a very large impact on his life. And what I've got here is a text that you'll have to stop the video to read, but essentially it talks about how Olympia was actually impregnated by Zeus, who then becomes the father of Alexander. And this bit of text that I have here was written by Plutarch in his section of a book called Life of Alexander. And so why don't you stop that and read about what Philip was having to deal with in terms of his wife being impregnated by Zeus. Here's a map of Alexander's empire, and as I said, he's a Macedonian. He takes over Greece. He then takes an army into Persia, goes south into Egypt and becomes pharaoh, and I'll show you a picture of that in the next scene. He then goes back into Persia, Central Asia, and goes all the way to the Indus River. And we talked about this during our lecture on Indian history, where he's in the north of India, he goes south, and his biggest impact on India was not Hellenism, but it was the fact that he disrupted all of these kingdoms, which led to Chandragupta Maurya. And then Alexander goes back into Persia, where he ultimately dies, so he doesn't get to take over the entire world, which I'm sure is what he was planning on doing. Here's an image of Alexander as the pharaoh of Egypt, and when he invaded, he took Egypt from the control of the Persians, so they were pretty happy with the fact that they were no longer under the thumb of the Persians, and they welcomed Alexander. And in this last scene, I just want to mention that at the death of Alexander, he left no heir, so he probably wasn't planning on dying that early. And so what happened ultimately is that his generals took over. And the three that are important for our class are the Antigones, who took over Greece. You've got the Ptolemies, who take over Egypt, and I'm sure you've all heard of Cleopatra. She was a Ptolemy. And then you've got the Seleucids, who take over Syria and Persia and India. And if you remember again our Indian history, it's Seleucus who's not very happy with being kicked out of India, so he tries to conquer it again, and Chandragupta Maurya kicked him out.